That's right, and Federal Parliament is gathering today with a reduced quorum to vote on the government's second economic support package before the Easter long weekend. Labor leader Anthony Albanese has indicated the ALP will not block the legislation from passing, even though he flagged Labor's desire to have all casuals included in the JobKeeper payment, not just casuals working for more than 12 months in the same job. This is a very small amount of what he had to say.
Never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And this is good legislation.
That's something we've heard a little bit throughout this pandemic. But this Easter long weekend is going to be hard for families living through domestic violence, being stuck indoors, many households unsure of where their next pay packet will come from. Joining me now is the Shadow Minister for Families and Social Services and for Preventing Family Violence, Linda Burney. Good afternoon, Ms Burney.
Good afternoon, Lindsay. How are you?
I'm very well. I believe we caught you at the end of a division that was required. You had to go and put your vote in.
Yeah, I did put my vote in. It was a very important division, and I can now say that the legislation has passed the House of Representatives, which will give $130 billion to create the JobKeeper payment.
Well, that is very good news. I'm sure many people will be very happy to hear that. Now, we've heard from Stephen Jones, your colleague, Shadow Assistant Treasurer,
Yes.
said it's Labor's obligation to point out anomalies and deficiencies in the JobKeeper scheme. What amendments was Labor pushing for that have made it through?
Well, there are 7 amendments. The 2 main ones were certainly around the issue of casuals. You've just highlighted that in your introduction. This bill only allows for casuals that have been in employment for 12 months with the one employer to actually receive the JobKeeper payment. And Labor is firmly of the view that there are about 1 million casuals that may miss out, and that should not apply. And the second, of course, is around the fact that there are about 1 million people in this country that are on various temporary visas that have access to absolutely no social security over the next coming period, and those that could not get home because of border closures should be eligible for social security like everyone else.
And did those amendments pass, or what's the passage for those
No,
amendments?
they haven't passed. Labor moved them as second reading amendments. They were not successful, but we, as Anthony just said in the intro, to make sure that the legislation got through was the most important thing. So we will agitate, of course, for those groups to be included. And under this piece of legislation, the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, now has the power, with the stroke of a pen, to be able to include the people that I've highlighted in the comments I've made so far.
I'm speaking to Linda Burney, the Shadow Minister for Families, Social Services and for Preventing Family Violence. Now, during this period of self-isolation, the coming Easter long weekend, many families experiencing domestic violence will be confined together. Children will be at risk, women will be at risk. What are you doing to keep families safe while we're all self-isolating?
Well, the government has made a financial commitment, but we are not convinced that it's going to the areas that will make a difference. A lot of the money that the government has announced is going into phone lines, and we are very concerned, as is the sector, because of the things that you've said, Lindsay, the financial troubles, huge strain and stress on families, being self-isolating or not going out, being together, makes a very toxic cocktail, particularly if there was already family violence in that mix. So we are very concerned, as is the sector, that there be money go to frontline services to make places available for women. For example, in France, the French government has bought a huge number of motel rooms for the night specifically for women and children who are wanting to get out of a dangerous situation. We are suggesting that the government needs to look at ways in which women can and their children can access services, and not everyone who's cooped up at home is going to be able to ring a hotline.
What about volunteer support groups? There's increased pressure on groups like Meals on Wheels, the Salvation Army. A lot of their volunteer workforce are older Australians at risk of infection. How do we supplement the missing volunteer force and keep those vital services running?
That is a very important issue that you've raised, and in particular, the point that you've made about a number of the volunteers are older people who are being recommended to self-isolate. We tried to move an amendment just a few hours ago to better support charities, but we are saying that the non-government sector, the charity sector, is really under pressure, and there needs to be a substantial investment in things like food bank, things like Oz Harvest, but also local community organisations that particularly provide food and connection for people that are often very, very isolated. There are some very innovative things happening, but it's important that people understand that the volunteer organisations, the charities, whose donations have dropped off dramatically, understandably, whose volunteers have dropped off, understandably, continue to get support. And Labor has been calling people over 70 in the community to make sure that they're fine, and that's something that we can do from our electorate offices.
Speaking of people over 70, we spoke to Kane Ellis from the Illawarra Aboriginal Medical Service last week after the government's advice was for people over 70 to stay home and Indigenous people over 50 to stay home. That is a 20-year gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and there has been a great concern for the health and safety specifically of remote Indigenous communities during coronavirus. What are you suggesting to be done to insulate these communities from the risk of infection?
Well, there's a number of things. Western Australia has closed its borders. The Northern Territory has closed its borders, and North Queensland is very much taking control community by community because of the nature of those communities. But there are a number of very large Aboriginal communities in the southeast of the state. For example, Burke, Brewarrina, Wilcannia, places in South Australia and in also Victoria. Most of those community towns are on highways, and it's really important that measures be put in place to protect those communities. But in terms of the remote communities and rural communities in particular, one of the main issues is making sure that there is food security, that there is actually food getting out to those places. Some of them, Lindsay, are so remote and have to rely on a community store. That's absolutely critical. Making sure that borders are not porous is absolutely crucial as well. Making sure that there is enough resources, particularly PPE, which is protective equipment, into the medical services and the clinics in those areas. And most importantly, which is a long-term issue, thinking about there is so much overcrowding in some of these communities. 20 people to a house is almost impossible, or it is impossible for self-isolation, and protecting the elders who are the carriers of knowledge, of wisdom, of story, of song, of culture and of language is incredibly important as well.
Linda Burney, thank you for taking time out. I know it's a very busy day for the reduced quorum in federal parliament, so
that's okay.
And thank you for being the first.
I hope that's been helpful to you and your listeners.
Thank you so much for being the first person to tell us also that the second economic support package has passed the lower house as well. And thanks for taking the time out, Linda. Cheers.
All the very best. Bye.
Cheers. That is Linda Burney, the Shadow Minister.